Hello there, Mark Raven here again with my second podcast. The first one was put out last week regarding clerical medical, but I still remain the retired financial analyst that I introduced myself as last week, and I'm still as intolerant as ever on the areas that I can find where poor financial services have been uncovered, detected, or been allowed to continue. Last week I highlighted a discrepancy, an anomaly that my wife and I have with clerical medical, in that we invested 65,000 British pounds with clerical medical in 2000, and they're now reporting it's worth about 135 British pounds today. The growth sounds great until you compare it with benchmarks, where it should have been worth about 200 had it been compared with any other comparable benchmark. The matter is currently with the Ombudsman. But what sort of ticks me with this particular complaint is A, that it's gotten this far with the Ombudsman, but B, I also have correspondence, and there's also recording out there where clerical medical's own staff acknowledge that they would be disappointed with the results that they're offering me. How they can defend themselves in that kind of situation is beyond me. But we'll have to wait and see how the Ombudsman rules and whether clerical medical decide to, as I keep saying, do the right thing, step up and say, yeah, we could have done better, and let's see if we can negotiate or agree a way forward. But that's not what I wanted to recap on today. What I like to talk about today is an area or a basis of a fraud that's been going on in England for many, England, Scotland, and Wales, the United Kingdom, for years and years and years. I first reported this to the British banks personally in about 2006, 2007. And there the banks just said, no, nothing wrong with it. Anything that does go wrong, it's the customer's fault. And it totally relates to a misconception that most bank customers have, in that when you put a payment through, whether you fill in the forms online or fill in the forms with a piece of paper, put transfers through, you see you're asked for the beneficiary's name, you're asked for the sort code or the routing number, and also the account number. And since the banks and the institutions ask for that information, we all just logically assume that the banks marry that all up before putting the transfer through. If they don't need the information, why would they ask for it? And in asking for it, they give the impression it's important. As it turns out, the beneficiary name is just asked for and then totally ignored. The only time payments go through is if the banks can acknowledge, or so the banks can track that there's an account number out there which is valid. If they can find an account number out there that's valid, the money will be put into that account, irrespective of whether there's a matching beneficiary name. Now, I personally have practiced with this system. Practice is the wrong word. I've personally experimented with this system before, and I can categorically say I've put some amazingly foolish, silly, laughable payments through using the headline name or the beneficiary's name of like Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck, and those payments went through. Admittedly, they were phenomenal sums, but they were just put in to a friend's account. My friends aren't Donald Duck and Mickey Mouse. It went into their account without any questions being asked. I just find that astounding. So I reported that flaw to the banks many years ago, based on two or three customers I was representing at the time, who'd suffered, £100,000 and £200,000 losses because a fraudster had picked up on that system and siphoned money out of personal accounts and predominantly small business accounts and put it into his own account. Admittedly, the fraudster was caught, was sentenced to, in two cases, 2 or 3 years in prison. But at the end of the day, the customers, my clients, lost their money, and the bank said it's totally the customer's fault, nothing to do with them. And I went through argument after argument, and they just stood firm and said, pretty much politely, get lost, we're not paying anything out. I reported that particular problem to the banks in 2006, and I was personally involved with claims relating to NatWest / Royal Bank of Scotland and Barclays Bank. And in both cases, the banks wrote to me and said, not our fault, customer's fault, should have been more diligent. And I used the argument that the system did promise to be accurate, to be robust, and also picked up on the fact that they were asking for information, which encouraged customers to assume that there was this cross-checking. Well, the cross-checking was never, as I just mentioned, the cross-checking never went through, but the frauds did go through. The matter escalated in 2006, 2007, believe it or not, to where Theresa May, who later became the British Prime Minister, she was a cabinet minister at the time, she actually asked for the banks to undertake a review of the system, and also one of the previous Prime Ministers, Tony Blair, his brother, who was a banking specialist, Queen's Counsel, he gave a legal opinion. But the bottom line here is the matter did escalate quite severely, and the banks were asked that the shortfall was focused on, and the net result is in 2018, the banks did acknowledge that the system did need to be improved, and they announced in October 2018 that the system would be modified to where the account name would be matched with the sort code and account numbers to ensure the fraud mechanism was diluted, was taken away from the fraudsters. It took them 13 years to do that, which I find is astounding. If the banks truly wanted to do something to protect their customers, they could have, I'm sure, done it in 13 months, but 13 years is really quite laughable. The banks promised to improve the system in July 2019. That's now been delayed, and they're now targeting sometime in 2020, which will take the overall delay to 14 years, which is disappointing, but let's hope it happens next year rather than the year after or the year after. It's as if they're kicking the can down the road, and the purpose of this particular video podcast is to try and focus attention on the fact that the system is being allowed to just continue unchecked, and in that time customers such as yourself and myself who have banking connections still in England a little bit, that system is still allowed to be abused by others. Some have estimated that particular opening has allowed fraud in the tune of £250 million per year to be undertaken. And you can do your own math as to how much that equates to over 15 years. And if you do that math, you also want to bear in mind any compound interest that would be relevant during that 15, 16 year period. Compound interest based on 2 or 3% savings rate, or 4 or 5% if there's some kind of investment rate. It's a huge amount of money, and the banks are able to allow that money to be fraudulently obtained by fraudsters, and they're able to stand back and say, nothing to do with us. And of course, during that whole period, the banks are making money, which sort of implies that the banks have no particular energy to rectify that problem. But say, fingers crossed, it'll be put to bed, and the system will be tightened up later this year. It's interesting to note that when the banks were originally told that they had to be responsible for credit card fraud, they were able to tighten that system up much, much quicker. So it seems once the government insisted that they took the liability for fraud, they acted a lot faster, corrected the problem, and I just wish that kind of energy was put into solving the sort code and account code fraud that's going through right now. But fingers crossed, the banks will no longer be able to continue with the lip service which they've been giving the government, and been giving the regulators, and been giving the public and the media over the past, say, many, many years. Hopefully, they'll finally put the system to right. Just covered this one, to be honest. The banks are sort of having their cake and eating it too. They're making a lot of money year on year on year. And I'm not complaining about the banks making money, but what does tick me off is that their sloppy systems are allowing customers to be defrauded, and they are acting with impunity. Customers are being forced to take the blame, to absorb the cost, while the banks continue to make money on the back of their own efficient services in one respect, but also inefficient services in the other respect, in that the fraud is being able to continue at $250 million, £250 million per year. It's interesting to note that, maybe I should have mentioned this earlier, interesting to note that I've undertaken a limited amount of research over here in the United States, and despite the United States being a much larger country, this particular check of account names and account names and account numbers has been in place for many, many, many years. So the American banks can do it. They've been doing it, probably for 10 or 15 years. It just makes me wonder why. I wonder skeptically, because we all really know why. It makes me wonder why the banks in England didn't capture the American system and put that in place. They have their own reasons, but bottom line is, those reasons resulted in many, many customers, of which some of them were mine, were defrauded of some substantial sums, say $250 million, £250 million per year. It's unacceptable. just to go back, it's the other reason for wanting to prepare this podcast is to educate any viewers out there who may not be aware that this name check and account number system is in place. It's not in place, and we need to be very, very vigilant when we're putting payments through. What I personally do is when I have a largest payment to go through, I'll put through maybe 10 or 15 pounds or $10 or $15 to make sure everything stacks up and the recipient that I've targeted receives the money. Once I've been able to establish that, I'll put the larger payment through. So it's education that I'm trying to share with anybody that watches this particular podcast. Just do everything very, very carefully and double and triple check. Don't rely on the system being accurate. And say a lot of people I know have fallen for that and have lost a lot of money. The other thing I like to do as much as I can with a little 6 or 7 minute soundbite here is encourage the government to get involved. I know the banks have said that the British banks have said that they're going to introduce a tighter system, but they've been kicking that can down the road for quite a while now. I don't see any reason why legislation couldn't be introduced to say, right, as of July 15th, 2020, the legislation will be in place, and if it's not, there'll be penalties. I think a line needs to be drawn in the sand to where changes do take place, and if they don't, the banks become liable for any fraud that's allowed to be processed through this non-checking of a system where we all believed was being verified. The other thing I think the bank should be forced to do, similar with the PPI claim system that went through England many years ago, and that's that the bank should, since they allowed the system to continue flawed for many years, what they should be forced to do is to go retrospectively through their fraud claims and put back the money that the defrauded customers suffered. So I personally have 3 or 4 friends, colleagues, contacts back in England still who were out of pocket 100, 200, 250,000 British pounds. That needs to be put right, and it's a massive amount of money, I know, but bottom line is the money has been lost by the customers, or the bank's customers, and as a result the banks have been able to make extra profit with that sloppy system being in place. And then again, it goes back to my point, the banks have been able to have their cake and eat it too. So I'd like to educate people who may be looking at this, and I'd like to encourage the government to legislate, to put a line in the sand and say, we need this double checking system, verification system in place. And I'd also like legislation put in place to ensure the bank go through their files and put back money into the customers' accounts who have been defrauded. I hope this video comes over well and didn't bore you too much, and look forward to presenting the next one to you. Thanks for your time.